Okay, we have Colin Liddell in the chat. Colin Liddell, how's it going, mate?
Yeah, hi Luke, how are you?
I'm good, man. It's been a long time since I've spoken to you.
Yeah, I think it's been a few months. So you're back in Australia.
I sure am. I'm in Sydney and loving it. It's spring
Yeah, it
heading
sounds like
into summer.
you're gonna eventually end up staying there. I feel.
Maybe you're right. There's certainly a higher quality of life here. I mean, there's just virtually no crime. there's like very little anger and social dislocation and people being at each other's throats.
Yeah, I guess the kind of safety factor becomes more important as you get older.
Yeah, and just like feeling at ease and comfortable, right? I think that also becomes more important as you get older. There's less need for extreme adventure.
Yeah, but I see you're still keeping an eye on things in America and around the rest of the world.
Yes, a little bit. The news in Australia is so boring because nothing's going on. So an interesting election in America. We don't really know if if Republicans are even going to take the House of Representatives, though in all likelihood they will. I'd say over a 90% chance that we'll have divided government. Republicans will take the House of Representatives. They also dominate the U.S. Supreme Court. Looks like Democrats are going to retain control of the U.S. Senate. But overall, surprisingly poor showing for Republicans, better than expected showing for Democrats. Any reaction to what happened with the midterm elections, Colin?
Yeah, actually, I wrote a piece back in August which kind of sort of predicted this. I thought that, there were certain elements attached to the Republican Party that would kind of put off the independents or the floating voters, as British people call them. I thought that Trump was having a kind of positive and negative effect, and sort of cancelling out the easy gains that the Republicans should have made.
And also the issue of abortion probably played a role, that this being a unifying issue for Republicans, but it's overall an election losing thing.
It's really hard to say. I mean, you have to go into these things in depth, and I think a lot of people seem to have voted Republican while also supporting kind of pro-abortion measures. So yeah, I just think that American politics it's becoming dominated by the kind of messy middle.
Yeah, and so the consensus is that these elections were bad for Trump, and so I think both you and I have a lot of skepticism of temporary who's up and who's down style of political analysis. For all we know, tomorrow Trump could be heading up. But do you think there's any important trajectory with regard to Donald Trump and the Republican Party and the wider American electorate?
Yeah, well, I think it looks like now there's a bit of a civil war going on in the Republican Party. I mean, Trump has come out quite strongly against DeSantis. He's trying to kind of finish off DeSantis before DeSantis becomes the obvious choice for the 2024 presidential. I think DeSantis is probably just going to play it cool and let Trump blow himself out. And there's a lot of people who are probably thinking Trump's maybe a bit too old now. He's sort of embarrassing himself. The people who liked his shtick before are probably less impressed by it now. So yeah, it's going to probably not be Trump, I think.
And do you have any perspective on Ron DeSantis? I've read several in-depth profiles of him. He seems honestly very unlikable on a personal level. People who work for him don't like him. People who interact with him don't like him. So he seems to be this combination of competence, high intelligence, tremendous ambition, with a lack of self-awareness and a lack of likability.
Yeah, the likability thing. I mean, who's actually likable? I mean, Trump's likable from a distance, but I don't think you'd actually like to work under Trump either. You know what I mean? So a lot of these people, they just do seem rather unlikable or kind of boring or kind of bland close up. I mean, that's probably what it takes to be a politician. You have to be a bit of a freak. I don't see anybody else being very likable. So I'm not really impressed by DeSantis. He doesn't seem to be an interesting personality. like you say, he does seem to be kind of competent. He does seem to be running his state quite well, I guess. Again, I'd have to look at that in greater detail to be sure. But things do seem to be going in his direction. It would be nice if somebody else could come along who had like real charisma, and who was quite likable and who was offering something new. But American politics is really quite arid and devoid of interesting characters. Besides Trump, who's a very flawed character, obviously.
So it seems. Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking about it from things from the Democrat side. They're really stuck as well. I don't see who they can really go with. I mean, if Biden's a problem because of his age and other factors, then who else have they got? So they don't seem to have very many prospects. So yeah, it's quite a depressing picture in terms of candidate talent.
So there was an essay in the Atlantic magazine a couple of weeks ago that got some resonance. It was a plea to have to let go of feuding over COVID. So that whatever perspective you took on COVID and lockdowns and vaccination, let's not have any recrimination. And so there seems to be, at least on a popular level, as opposed to the elite and scientific level, kind of a growing recognition that the lockdowns were too extensive, too intrusive, too much, overdone, and that people like Ron DeSantis, who did not order Florida into lockdown and certainly got out of it sooner than almost anyone else, but it seems to be, at least in popular terms, that there's growing awareness that the Ron DeSantis type approach was the right one. I'm not saying that it was scientifically, definitively. I'm just saying that seems to be a vote winner. Do you have any thoughts?
I think our societies have become over-feminized, and we place a lot of stress on harm avoidance and safety, things like that, and probably too much. And of course, when COVID came out, people did err very, very strongly on the side of caution. And in retrospect, obviously they did everything quite wrongly, I think. In most countries, I'm thinking here mainly of the UK. The UK really did too much, I think, and that's kind of had serious knock-on effects. It's caused a lot of economic instability, political instability. The UK is struggling with all sorts of budgetary issues now. I think they're going to have a statement from the Chancellor quite soon about severe spending cuts and tax raises and things like that. And this is all because of the furlough scheme that they had, which paid people during the crisis so they could have a very, very long and extensive lockdown. At the time, it was very, very hard to judge just how bad COVID was going to be. So I think we should be quite generous in how we judge people about COVID. But I think the general problem is that we live in these very over-feminized societies, which place much too much emphasis on safety.
There may also be a growing sense that the Brexit has been a disaster for Britain. I mean, it's certainly trimmed economic growth. It's certainly not been a good thing for Britain's economy. Do you have any thoughts on whether or not Brexit has been a disaster for Great Britain?
I don't think it really has been a disaster. Of course, that's the partisan view of people who emotionally want to be in Europe, and they will say that, and they'll do confirmation bias and select certain things which prove their emotional predilections. I think you could say that Brexit was quite good for Britain in some ways. Britain was, because we were not tied to Europe, the country was able to roll out vaccines much earlier and more efficiently than the rest of Europe. Economically, it's kind of hard to say what the situation is, but the good thing about Brexit is it places Britain in a position where it can make its own decisions, and the connection to Europe is still actually providing a kind of drag on what Britain does. I mean, one thing that is a big issue in Britain now is the illegal migrant or refugee crisis, with people crossing the channel in rubber boats from France. I think there's been about 40,000 people in 1 year crossing directly from France to England in rubber boats. One of the reasons the British can't get on top of this crisis is because the European Court of Human Rights, to which Britain still kind of signed up, has declared its immigration policy illegal.
And what do you think of the prospects for Rishi Sunak? We're looking at probably no better than a 20% chance of the Tories getting re-elected in the next election. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Rishi's a nice boy. He's doing his best. He's obviously a kind of quite a smart person. He's probably running the economy reasonably well, given the kind of circumstances and what the kind of cards he's been dealt. And some people actually say he dealt his own cards because he was the chancellor when Boris Johnson's furlough scheme was going out. So he's trying to do a kind of efficient managerial job, I think. But even if he does a very good job, there are going to be a lot of difficult decisions. And right now, I think Britain's sort of heading into a kind of general strike almost. There's a lot of public sector workers coming out on strike, and various other workers demanding all sorts of unrealistic pay rises. And this is, of course, some of the economic blowback from COVID, of course, because they spent too much money and it's caused inflation, and now everybody wants a pay rise. So it's a very difficult to manage year and a half that he has before the next election. It's very difficult to see him coming out on top of this. I also think people are not quite happy having a prime minister who's obviously a foreigner. Of course, you're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to express your political incorrectness. But these things don't really go away just because people are not allowed to talk about them. So I think for all sorts of reasons, you'd have to say that the chances of Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party doing well at the next election are quite low. And, that won't even be entirely down to the performance of the government. Labour are not particularly... they're not doing particularly well either. I mean, of course, in the opinion polls, Labour's kind of riding high. But most people don't seem to be very impressed by Keir Starmer either, So he's not exactly generating a lot of excitement. This is not like Tony Blair in 1997. When Tony Blair came in 1997, it was a massive swing to the Labour Party. There was a lot of enthusiasm about him. Of course, obviously it was misplaced enthusiasm because Tony Blair was a disaster in lots of ways. But, there was a real feeling at the time that something big was going to happen. And you don't see any of that with the Labour Party today. It's a different kind of politics. It's sort of like there's a kind of like an anti-politics going on now, both in the UK and America, where there's no charisma, there's no real enthusiasm, there's no real thrill anymore. And people kind of are just... voting in a very lackluster kind of way, and usually for negative reasons.
Now, Rishi Sunak seems competent. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think I kind of emphasized that earlier. Yeah, he seems like a competent, kind of nerdy little guy. Good for him.
I mean, and we're talking about competence at an extremely difficult job at an extremely difficult time in the nation's history. So this isn't like ordinary levels of competence. This is a very difficult situation that he finds himself in.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping that, Liz Truss would still be there. It would be much more of an exciting roller coaster. Liz and Kwasi Kwarteng, that was kind of shaping up to be a bit of fun, I thought. I was kind of disappointed when Rishi came in. It just took the heat off everything.
And the prospects for Britain just seem quite dim. Not just in the immediate term, but in the long term. I mean, Britain has a lot of work to do to try to establish a viable path forward. Is that fair?
That sounds overly negative. What are you kind of thinking of when you say that?
Well, they've suffered tremendously economically from leaving Brexit. I don't believe they ever attained a special trade deal with the United States. So they're neither in Europe nor having the equivalent of a free trade deal with the United States. And so I just don't see where the country goes from here.
But I think all the economic problems are due to COVID and the lockdown and the government spending too much money on the furlough scheme. I don't think there's any other real problem. I mean, Britain's economy is not like other countries' economies. It's a kind of sub-imperial economy. It's based upon its relationship to the present world order, and its relationship to America is important. But its participation in the EU was causing conflict and problems with that, I felt. With regards to the EU, it was a net importer on a very large scale, and so it does have a lot of leverage with Europe as well. So I don't think things are particularly negative about its economic picture. The British economy before Brexit was mainly an importer, which was exporting services, and it still is, in the same position.
And anything about the war in Ukraine that has attracted your interest and attention since the last couple of months?
I think almost everything that happens seems to confirm my early view of the war. And my early view of the war was that the Russians were overreaching. They were, the Russians struggled for almost 20 years to get control of the Chechen problem. And Chechnya, if anybody knows about it, it's a dot on the map. You hardly see it if you look at a map of Russia. It's a tiny place. Its population is tiny. I think it's about 1.5 million people in Chechnya, and it took the Russian military and political system about almost 20 years to get on top of the situation. The way they were able to do that finally was by granting the Chechens all sorts of privileges within the Russian Empire. And this is the same country that thought it could kind of breeze in and sort of take over most of the Ukraine. And this is after several years where the Ukrainian military was being trained and prepared and armed by the Western Alliance. And so I was pretty confident that the Russian army wouldn't do quite so well as a lot of the kind of Putin chuds thought in those early days. So yeah, the Russian army has never really been very good militarily. If you look at the whole history of the Russian military endeavor over the decades and centuries, they've always been quite poor performers, always with high casualty rates, and their only asset is they can throw away human lives at a very high rate that other countries would blanch at.
Yeah, and what about both Russia and Europe are in a kind of a nasty way? I mean, Europe badly needs Russian energy. Russia is suffering tens of thousands of casualties and has been sanctioned fairly effectively. Who do you expect to blink first between Russia and Europe in this confrontation over Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a hard one, though. I think the power structure, if you like, global power structure, is still very much in force. The European countries, the NATO countries, they're still on board with America. America is still on board with standing up to Russia. And that would not have been affected much, even if the Republicans had made significant advances. I think with the recent election, that's a real signal that the status quo is completely unchanged with regard to Russia. So America and Europe are probably more united than they have been for some time. And they are going to do what they can to face down Russia. It's going to be very hard for countries like Germany or France to find a kind of independent middle way in that. They're going to be more or less pushed along the route of standing up to Russia, even though they might sometimes have some doubts and some sort of third positionist leanings there. So I think eventually the weight of the West and the global system will make Russia blink. And I think there are signs of that. I think the Chinese have come out quite strongly against Russia. thinking about using tactical nuclear weapons. And the Russians do seem to be fighting a less ambitious war now. They seem to be on the back foot, trying to hold on to some of their earlier gains against a more aggressive and assertive Ukraine. And so their policy kind of reminds me a little bit of the Japanese policy in World War II. And in World War II, the Japanese quickly expanded over a large area, and then their policy was to bleed the Western powers through defensive warfare. And they thought that if they could make the Americans suffer enough through defensive warfare, then the Americans would finally decide to cut a deal with them. And the Russians seem to be adopting a broadly similar policy. Like they've taken over parts of the Ukraine, this kind of corridor, this land corridor along the Sea of Azov, and they think that if we just defend this hard enough and make the Ukrainians bleed enough, eventually there'll be some sort of compromise in our favor. So that's what they're trying to pull off. But given the poor quality of the Russian military, the sort of military supply issues that they've had, and the amount of quite advanced tech flown into the Ukraine, I think the Ukrainians might be able to flip a lot of their positions, and that could end quite badly for the Russians.
And what's been going on in Japan that's captured your interest over the last few months?
Well, earlier I was referring to the sort of anti-politics that we see in the West, like in Britain and America. There's a lack of enthusiasm for the politicians who are in power and challenging for power. Well, Japan is the perfect example of anti-politics. It's been an anti-politics country for as long as I can remember. Whoever is prime minister is always unpopular. But there's nobody else outside the positions of power who is popular. So, things just kind of trundle along with sort of a mild feeling of discontent. And the present prime minister seems to be unpopular now. And, because of the Abe assassination, this sort of threw up the connection between the LDP and the Moonies. And this is something that's still bubbling along, and the present government seems to be being blamed for its connection to the Moonies. And this is causing, I think it caused some minister to resign recently. But, I just find Japanese politics extremely tedious and boring. So I seldom wish to discuss it.
Now, it's interesting. The assassin of Abe essentially got what he wanted, a national conversation and scrutiny of the Unification Church and its ties with politicians.
Yeah, that's true. If he hadn't done that, this would obviously be ignored by the media, but it's sort of given the story legs, and it keeps going, this story that the LDP is somehow in cahoots with the Moonies, and probably there's not really that much there. I mean, all political parties are quite happy to take money from all sorts of groups. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're controlled and owned by them, though.
And anything going on with China that's captured your attention over the past few months?
I think there was a bit of hysteria about China in the West. There seemed to be this idea in connection with the latest Communist Party conference. There was this idea that Xi Jinping had become ruler for life. He was this new Mao Zedong character, bent upon confrontation and possibly even conflict with the West. And of course, this was tied into the war in the Ukraine. There was the idea that the West was fully stretched dealing with Russia, so it couldn't possibly do anything about China taking over Taiwan. And now was a good time for China to strike and take over Taiwan. Blah blah blah. So there's this kind of rather hysterical estimation of what was going on, and this led to a lot of people being worried about investments in China and decoupling from China. And I think that's sort of going away now, and people are calming down again, and they're realizing once again that nothing really has changed. I mean, China's still making 95% of your iPhones, China's still mass producing Tesla cars and so on. So, I think it's pretty much a realization that things have not really changed, and that Xi Jinping is a much more kind of sensible and intelligent leader than, say, Vladimir Putin at the moment.
Hmm. And have you paid any attention to the Kino Casino?
Oh yeah. I sometimes watch that, and I see they had my old friend Millennial Woes on recently. So yeah, I did sort of dip into that.
And do you have any thoughts or impression of Kino Casino?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're trying to provide a critique of certain personalities, in the dissident right. I would say that the BPP guy, the big fat guy, he's quite talented, he's quite intelligent. Sometimes they do quite good content, and sometimes, I think the problem is that they do these quite long streams, and they go on and on for hours and hours, and sometimes the quality dips. But sometimes the quality is quite good and quite interesting. Of course, there's all these issues about Andy Warski and what he's doing off camera. So yeah, it's just part of the great big colourful shit show that is the dissident right. So I've got nothing against it, and I find some of it kind of amusing and interesting. I think the show they did on Millennial Woes was quite good. Of course, it was a friendly kind of interview, but they did ask him some kind of hardball questions from time to time, mainly about his gay past.
And what's the latest on Millennial Woes, to the extent that you're aware? I mean, where is he in his journey?
Well, I think the real story with Millennial Woes is the growing irrelevance of his take on things. He developed a kind of very conspiratorial sort of red ice radio view of the world, and that's the path that he chose to go down. And so his takes are increasingly lame and conspiratard, and that's fine. There's a lot of people who like that, and relatively easy way to maintain an audience with low intellectual input. So I'd say that's where he's at. Personally, the personal story hasn't changed much. We all know that, Millennial Woes, his tragic story, 10 years in his basement after going to art college and being disgusted by London's multiculturalism, and then slowly emerging into the day of light through his YouTube channel and his very frank and kind of heart-wrenching videos. And then from there, he managed to build up quite an audience. And then he had these scandals, quotation marks, where he was being accused of all sorts of things by these women. And so it hasn't really changed beyond that. I mean, the basic Millennial Woes timeline and storyline is quite well established, and there's nothing really new there. It's not like he suddenly got married and had a lot of kids, So the real story is that his critique, his view of the world, hasn't really gone anywhere, and it's actually in several ways deteriorated. I mean, I occasionally have a quick listen to a gram of Woes to see what sort of takes he has, and it's sort of embarrassing, some of the kind of low quality, paranoid nature of a lot of these takes.
Yeah, and he seems to embody a very common phenomenon that a lot of people say become red pilled on some aspect of reality that is denied in the media. That they realize that they've been lied to about X or Y, and then they just assume that they're being lied to about everything and become paranoid and conspiratist, and they increasingly lose touch with reality and become less effective. It's amusing that being red-pilled leads so many people to becoming less effective at dealing with reality.
Yeah, that's true. And, this is a problem that people who live stream too much have is, when you talk that much, you don't really have time for like reading and thinking and understanding the world. You're too busy presenting your view of the world to actually have a sensible view of the world.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But I think what's even 5 times, 10 times more powerful is audience capture. That when you live stream and you have any success whatsoever, in all likelihood, if you're a live streamer, you're probably socially maladjusted to begin with. Then you get some positive feedback from an audience, which becomes far more intoxicating because you're far more vulnerable to it than a normal person. And then you are captured by your audience and you don't want to say or do anything that will upset them. So you become your audience's poodle. And then it's a lot easier to get a lower IQ audience than a higher IQ audience. And this seems to be a very familiar path for many alt-right live streamers. And it's not something from which I've been exempt either.
Well, I think in your case, you've kind of been aware of it at least, and you've tried to deal with it. And I think you've made some kind of quite good choices to avoid falling into the usual pitfalls. So kudos to you there, Luke.
Thanks, Colin. But do you agree with my analysis that probably the most powerful intoxicant is, for many podcasters and dissidents, is developing an audience that is generally socially maladjusted types who devote so much to live streaming and podcasting. And then because they're maladjusted, they're even more vulnerable to the intoxicating effect of having an audience. And this tends to lead them into a negative spiral.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I know where you want to go, and I'm inclined to kind of generally agree with you, but I don't want to overemphasize the emotional and psychological drivers of content creators. I think content creators should really focus on the content, the quality of the content, the data in the content, the logic of their ideas, things like that. I think you can have all sorts of weird emotional drives to do what you do, but I think finally content should be king, and the quality of the content should really be the preeminent factor. Like, is what you're saying true? Is what you're saying valid? Is what you're saying an accurate description of the world? That's really the key for me. And you might have all sorts of twisted, sick, psychological and sexual reasons for exploring and pushing into this content. But it's like the thing that you're saying, what are you actually saying? And does it actually bear exposure to reality?
Have you experienced audience capture? I mean, you've had more than your share of success at times, so you've always aimed at a much higher IQ audience than most of the people we talk about. But have you had the experience of struggling with audience capture?
It's not been my focus, to be honest. I really want to work out my own ideas for my own benefit and anybody else who might be interested, but I'm not really too focused on the audience. I mean, over the years, I have had various kinds of audiences. And I have to say the quality of my own audiences has been quite poor. I mean, there have been intelligent people who have consumed my content, who have commented on my content, but they have always been very much in the minority. It's been much more a question of batting off the trolls.
And you mentioned Richard Spencer's wife visited you in Japan, and there are rumors about that relationship. So what the hell? What has been your relationship with Richard Spencer's wife?
Let's just say my relationship with Richard Spencer's wife took up a lot of space rent-free in his head for a number of years.
I'm just thinking you've got an advantage in that you just seem so grounded compared to most of the people that we're talking about. Like, I've never seen you or heard you or read you coming from an unhinged place. Is that fair to say? Your emotions don't tend to slop over?
Well, yeah, I actually occasionally have been unhinged, I have to say, once or twice. So yeah, always have a filter, always have a delay button.
Yeah, I mean, you always have to write knowing that there will be an enormous audience or some very capable, smart people looking to destroy you based on deliberate misinterpretation of what you're saying.
Yes, that's definitely been the case with the dissident right and within the dissident right.
I had a thought a few weeks ago that much of Richard Spencer's trajectory can be accounted for by his theatrical background and theatrical nature. He's incredibly compelling as intellectual entertainment, meaning his voice, his manner has just filled with drama. And it talks about in high school, his life ambition was to become a theater director. So everything we do affects us, and some things we do affect us more than others. So I think people would have greater understanding and more empathy for Richard Spencer if they perhaps accounted for, you can understand Richard by understanding that he is a theatrical producer, including of his own life. Is that fair? Is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
important?
You're trying to say he's a bit of a drama queen, aren't you?
Yeah, that's an element of it, but just being a drama queen is not. He lives life as theater. He's a Wagnerian, Nietzschean, theatrical type of person who wants to compel your attention.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think you've got to be careful when you try to put people into boxes, not to, sort of shoehorn them in too much. And there's also another side to Richard. He's sort of semi-autistic as well. So, there's a kind of weird introvert extrovert mix there. So he doesn't really fit a lot of the convenient categories, I'd say. And I do think he has a genuine interest in ideas, and he's a very clever person. And so some of his ideas are actually quite interesting. But then there's a kind of also a very emotional aspect to him where he can be overwhelmed by certain things and certain connections and certain personalities. And so he's very, very susceptible to leadership as well, in the sense of being led.
Which would all make sense for someone who's so theatrical.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, but I mean, I think this is an interesting film script you're writing there, Luke. So good luck with that.
I just think that once you could just get a handle on someone's genre, right? I mean, Richard is a shock jock. Like you don't blame Ben Shapiro for not being, or one should not blame Ben Shapiro for not being a careful scholar. He's a shock jock, and Richard's a shock jock, and Howard Stern's a shock jock, and Michael Savage is a shock jock.
Yeah, yes and no, but I think that behind a lot of these kind of otherwise odd, interesting, and sometimes laughable alt-right and distant right characters, there is a lot of genuine concern about the world and the problems of the world and how to solve the problems of the world. And I would say, Millennial Woes, whatever you think of him, and no matter how absurd you may think certain aspects of his personal story may be, he's actually a person who seems sincerely upset by real problems in the world. And I would say, the same thing about somebody like Richard Spencer and even people who come to the wrong conclusions or who misanalyze the world. Lots of these people on the distant right, they are actually trying to do something good and noble, when you get right down to it. And I think Richard is somebody who's tried to engage with the world, and he's perceived there are problems with the world. There's problems with the West. There's problems with Western culture, and these underlying problems of the culture and the ideology of the West are things that have to be addressed. And he's made it his efforts to try to deal with them and to find a solution to some of these problems. And you might disagree with those, that particular idea or solution, but I think we should also give these people credit for at least trying to do something, often at great, personal sacrifice.
Are you familiar with Toby Young? He's a writer for The Spectator in the United Kingdom.
Oh yeah, I am familiar. I have sometimes, read his columns or articles. Seems like a basic bitch libertarian to me, but he's quite an intelligent person. Most of the things that he says, you can nod along to.
Yeah, so he also exemplifies the challenge of changing genres. So he was essentially a shock jock in writing. He wrote a book detailing all the stupid things he did when he was hired by Vanity Fair. He's made mocking himself his trope, his reliable go-to for getting published. And then he took on education reform a few years ago, and it didn't really take because he has this background of being this ridiculous character who pokes fun of himself and says outrageous things and then calls himself out for his outrageous behavior. And then he tried to transition to being a genuine advocate for educational reform. And then he's tried to transition to being a thoughtful critic of lockdown policies. And when he tries to delve into the statistics, he tends to box them up. So a lot of clowns, like Toby Young, made a career of being a clown, but a lot of clowns eventually want to be taken seriously, and it's not an easy transition, and it may not even be in his wheelhouse of strengths. I have no doubt that he does have some important things to say, but he is not, a meticulous researcher. He's not, meticulously skilled with statistics and academic analysis, and he just seems to embody the great difficulty when you try to transition from being a clown to being a serious thinker, and it doesn't quite take. Any thoughts on Toby Young and his trajectory?
Well, it's probably a lot easier to do it the other way around, isn't it? To transition from a serious thinker to a clown. But I know a little bit about Toby Young. I'm not so familiar with the things that you're referring to, but you are mentioning that he decided to take a special interest in education. I imagine that's pretty much like a can of worms, because there's a lot of vested interests in education. It's very, very politicized. It's very, very dangerous to try to go into it and reform it. This is one of the problems that the UK has, and much more so than whether it's in the EU or not. It's these heavily centralized public sector areas like education, like the National Health Service, things like that. These kind of holdovers from the 1940s nationalization and centralization of British society. Because all these areas have become nationalized and centralized at some point in the past, they're also very heavily unionized, and therefore they're very, very difficult to reform. And any attempt to reform them usually causes a complete shitstorm of reaction. So I think that's probably the problem that Toby Young's efforts is exposing, I would say. So, I mean, the UK really needs root and branch reform in certain key areas, but politically it's almost impossible to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the chances of Boris Johnson becoming a better than average prime minister one day?
You mean by being re-elected at some point, and then
but being more competent than he was during, say, his last year in office?
I mean, I never bought into the idea that Boris Johnson was this terrible prime minister. I mean, he obviously had a lot of curveballs hurled at him, and I think he didn't do a particularly bad job while he was prime minister. Of course, he was very limited in what he could do, being a Conservative Party leader and so on. The idea of Boris Johnson returning to 10 Downing Street, that seems a bit remote at the moment. But of course, you have to think about where things are going. Probably Rishi Sunak's going to be destroyed at the next election. And then there will be a lot of movement in the Conservative Party to sort of bring back somebody like Boris, who's associated with success. My analysis is that, Boris was a successful politician because he got lucky with this kind of Brexit mood. And this enabled him to take over the Conservative Party, and also enabled him to hoover up a lot of normally leftist or Labour votes. Whether he would be able to do that the second time around, I kind of doubt. That's probably one of the reasons why I regret Boris being kicked out. I wanted to see what would have happened with Boris at the next election. And my guess was, with Brexit sort of out of the way, he would have done a lot less well with the voters. And so we can never really test that now. So I kind of have a feeling that even if Boris does get back in, he wouldn't be that successful. And the real reason for that is it's very, very difficult for any prime minister to be successful with the way that Britain is organized at the moment. Because like I was just saying, with regard to Toby Young, the country has several key areas that need very, very radical root and branch reform to actually work well. And the political cost for delving into those areas is just so high that the most successful prime ministers are the ones who can ignore the most pertinent issues.
Yeah. Okay, Colin, thanks so much for stopping by the show. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again.
Okay, it's been fun, Luke. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.